I think I mentioned it once before, that what is the sign of a good and successful synagogue? And one of my teachers used to say that it is not a good rabbi, but it is a fact that community can cope without a rabbi. And I think that today we saw it very well. So the part of the service is taken by a member of community, and the sermon will be delivered by a member of community as well. And Bernie Bulkin, unfortunately, he couldn't come here in person, but he is on Zoom now from home. And Bernie, please, over to you.
That's not burning.
Yes, Bernie, you probably need to unmute your mic.
I'm unmuted.
Yes, excellent. We can see you now.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Our beloved rabbi and teacher, John Rayner, once said to me that the ideal LJS sermon should start with the Torah portion, work its way forward to something of current relevance to the congregation, and then work its way back to the Torah portion, not taking more than 11 minutes to do so. 10 would be better. As with many other pieces of wisdom he imparted to me, I have always tried to follow this advice in sermons I have given. Now, Igor has wisely chosen to read the section from Exodus this week known as HaChodesh, one of the special portions of Torah reading in the weeks leading up to Pesach. The regular portion for this week is Tazria, as he mentioned, from Leviticus, which I want to spend a few minutes considering this morning. Now, it has to be said that Parshat Tazria is one of the more difficult as a starting point for an LJS sermon, expounding as it does laws of impurity and defilement, starting with the impurity of women following childbirth, which is the meaning of the word Tazria, and then majoring on skin diseases, the Hebrew word being tzara'at, often translated, most of the time mistranslated as leprosy, and now more often as white scaly patches. The parasha also has quite a lot to say about baldness in men, and when this can and cannot be proof of impurity, something which I am sure is of interest to at least half the congregation today. A survey of American rabbis a few years ago rated Tazria as the very worst portion to have for your bar or bat mitzvah. Nonetheless, it is surprisingly relevant to my experiences of the last 2 years of living with this particular disease of COVID, dealing with my own positive tests of the last few weeks, the disease of others, being in a crowded place where the unmasked are in close proximity. As we read in this portion, using the Plout translation, as for the person with a leprous affection, the clothes shall be rent, the head shall be left bare, and the upper lip shall be covered over, and that person shall call out, impure, impure. The person shall be impure as long as the disease is present. Being impure, that person shall dwell apart in a dwelling outside the camp. Even within the Bible, practices seem to evolve. While in Leviticus, the idea of strict isolation is clearly stated, by the time we get to Job, which is a subversive book in many respects, things are different. So we read just a short excerpt from Job. Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and inflicted loathsome sores on Job from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. Now, when Jacob's 3 friends heard of all these troubles that had come upon him, each of them set out from his home. They sat with him on the ground for 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. Apparently, for Job's friends, quarantine was not the desired approach. Tazria also has a great deal to say about the role of clothing. Let me again give you a small excerpt. When an eruptive affection occurs in the cloth of wool or linen fabric, If the affection in the cloth is streaky green or red, it shall be shown to the priest, and the priest, after examining the affection, shall isolate the affected article for 7 days. Now, we may think that we have advanced so much in our medical understanding, and we have, over the last 7,000 years, but we still want the lips to be covered by a mask. We still want isolation, quarantine. And is it so great a stretch to view those with COVID as somehow impure? What is different, of course, aside from the medical knowledge that led to vaccines and treatment, is that in the Torah, the central role for defining and removing impurity is with the priests. They perform certain rituals on defined days. For example, having a woman end her period of impurity by bringing a lamb and a pigeon to the priest to sacrifice and make expiation on her behalf. The priests in Tazria and related portions are not performing any medical function. They do not attempt to cure tzara'at. This is in distinction to other ancient and some modern religions. Indeed, the Bible says nothing about medical practices, cures being mostly effected when they occur by miracles performed by prophets such as Elisha. A few centuries later, however, in Talmudic writings, there's a lot of medical advice, and still later, Maimonides, who was a great physician as well as one of our foremost scholars, mixes medical and religious advice quite freely. The pandemic of the last 2 years has certainly brought to front of mind many questions about how we as a society and we as the LJS respond to prevalent disease. If at the core of progressive Judaism is our moral code, then living with this pandemic, experiencing something like it for the first time for most of us, forces us to find answers to at least some of these questions. And some have been easier than others. We certainly have no doubt now that participation in services and life cycle events is more important than the medium by which we do so. From the first online seders of 2020 to the enormous global reach of our online services, I think the pandemic has spurred us on to changes that we would probably have only made over decades. So too, progressive Judaism has always looked to a dialogue between Jewish wisdom and the wisdom of the world. And nowhere is this more true than in our embrace of science and medicine. Certainly, progressive Judaism had no hesitation about the importance of vaccination. If vaccines showed us the immense progress of scientific wisdom, the ancient practice of quarantine as the most effective mechanism to control disease showed us the limitations. But these, I think, are the easy parts. What about responsibility for our actions during the pandemic? Is it individual responsibility, community consensus, or government rules that determine how we behave? In our Judaism, where individual responsibility plays a big role, how quick should we be to give that up? After all, in the LJS, we allow, indeed encourage, a range of practices based on individual decisions. And where we mandate something for everyone, it has been in the past only after a lot of heated debate, as anyone who has been a member of the services committee of this synagogue will surely agree. So was it right to mandate that everyone had to cover the upper lip with a mask when we do not mandate that everyone must cover their head with a kippah? They're not equivalent. One has health consequences and the other probably does not. I'm not saying it was the wrong decision, but that it is a difficult balance. If progressive Judaism recognizes the importance of the state in protecting us, it is also cognizant of the dangers in its overreaching. The prophets, beginning with Samuel, preached about this, but even more deeply imbued in the Jewish experiences are the positive and negative roles of the state during millennia of this diaspora life. And all of Jewish teaching, both in the Torah and the many prophetic books, is imbued with the principle that both the civil and religious laws are there for all people, and that when someone, because they are in a position of power, thinks they are above them, they will be brought down. I said earlier that the Torah in Tazria and adjacent portions focuses on ritual impurity, certainly in the case of women in childbirth as an example. But it is clear that in describing the diseases called tzara'at, it is very much concerned about protecting the community from what it saw as a communicable disease. In both cases, childbirth and tzara'at, there was mystery. Much about childbirth and the dangers to both mother and child were mysterious, as were the reasons why severe skin diseases sometimes erupted, were transmitted, and subsided. We have such mysteries at the start of this pandemic too, and I dare say there are some aspects that are still mysterious. Reading and listening to some of the detailed precautions in our portion about clothing, for example, are reminiscent of the precautions people took 2 years ago about cleaning the surfaces in food packaging brought home from Waitrose to remove traces of the virus. Tazria, indeed, many of the portions in Leviticus present us with difficult texts, which we might be tempted to dismiss as coming from a far more primitive time. Rather than do that, I suggest we engage with them, being modest about our own time and its achievements, because events like those of the last 2 years reinforce that need for modesty. Shabbat Shalom.